I never planned on going that deep into the woods. I was just looking for a quiet place to camp, somewhere far enough from people that I wouldn't hear cars or see headlights flashing through my tent at night. Somewhere I could sit by a fire and forget about everything for a few days. I should have picked a spot closer to civilization. I parked my truck at the end of an old dirt road that barely looked drivable. The last few miles had been rough, rocks, deep potholes, and tree branches that scraped against the sides of the cab. It didn't seem like anyone had been down that way in years. That was exactly what I wanted. I locked up, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. I had a tent, food, water, and a hunting knife strapped to my belt. That should have been enough. It wasn't. I hiked for a few hours before finding a good spot. It was a small clearing just big enough for my tent and a fire. The ground was dry, the trees were thick enough to block the wind, and there was a small stream nearby for water. It felt like a perfect place to camp. By the time the sun started setting, I had a fire going. I ate some jerky, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and stared up at the stars. No city lights. No noise. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the bushes. I told myself it was just animals. It had to be, but I never heard the sound of hooves or paws. No twigs snapping under four legs. Just the slow, deliberate crunch of something moving nearby. It stopped when I held my breath. Started again when I exhaled. I sat up, gripping my knife. Nothing. I scanned the trees, my pulse pounding in my ears. The fire cast long shadows against the trunks, flickering with the wind. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but I didn't see anything. And the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't going away. It was circling me. I didn't sleep that night. The woods felt different in the morning, colder. Even with the sun shining, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I looked for tracks, but the ground was too packed to show prints. Whatever had been out there, it had been careful. I thought about heading back to my truck, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I had come all this way to relax, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin it. So I stayed. I spent the day fishing in the stream, cooking over the fire, trying to enjoy the quiet. But the quiet never felt peaceful. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something between the branches. A shape that disappeared the second I focused on it. I told myself it was nothing, until I found the rope. It was hanging from a tree a few hundred yards from my campsite. Thick, old, tied into a loop, a noose. It swayed slightly in the breeze, the fibers frayed and weathered. It had been there for a long time, long enough that the bark had started growing around the knot. I stared at it for a long time, a sinking feeling growing in my gut. Why would there be a noose this deep in the woods? And more importantly, who had put it there? I didn't want to know. I turned back toward my campsite, moving fast. My heart pounded. The trees felt taller, the shadows darker. Something about that place was wrong. I needed to leave. But when I reached my campsite, I stopped cold. Something had changed. My tent was open. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the open flap. I hadn't left it like that. Had the wind done it? No. The stakes were still in place, the zipper undone halfway. Someone had been there. I forced myself to step forward, every instinct screaming at me to run. The fire pit was untouched. My bag was still where I left it, but inside the tent, my sleeping bag had been pulled open. Not torn, not thrown aside, unzipped, like someone had been in it, like they had laid there. I felt my stomach tighten. I grabbed my bag and knife, kicked dirt over the fire, and left. I moved fast, cutting through the woods instead of following the path I had taken in. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing. The trees were thick, the underbrush slowing me down. Branches scraped my arms. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the pines. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine, somewhere behind me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I tightened my grip on the knife and kept walking. Faster now. The sound followed. I broke into a run. The footsteps behind me did too. I didn't look back. I could see the dirt road ahead, my truck just visible through the trees. Almost there. Be then, a sharp crack. The ground vanished beneath me. The pit I hit hard. The air shot from my lungs, pain flaring through my ribs. My vision blurred. I had fallen into a hole, deep, at least 10 feet down. The walls were smooth, packed with damp earth. No roots to climb. A trap. I looked up, chest heaving. The trees swayed against the sky, the last light of day fading. Then a shadow, a face, peering over the edge, staring down at me. I scrambled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The face was gone. Footsteps crunched above. Slow, heavy, then silence. I gripped my knife, pulse hammering. I wasn't getting out on my own. Whoever had dug this hole, whoever had been following me, they were still up there, watching, waiting. The night closed in. The cold seeped through my clothes. I stayed awake, my back pressed against the dirt wall, listening. The footsteps returned in the early hours. Something was dragged across the ground above. Then a rope, dropped into the hole. Not a way out. A noose, dangling inches from my face. I didn't wait. I jumped, clawing at the walls, kicking off the dirt. I tore at the roots, pulling myself up inch by inch. My hands bled. My nails cracked. Then fingers, gripping the edge. I threw myself over, gasping, heart hammering. The ground was empty.
No footprints.
No signs of movement. Just the rope, swaying in the wind. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, keys shaking in my hands. The engine roared to life. I tore down the road, my tires spitting dirt. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, they weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to keep me. I had always loved camping. The stillness of the forest, the quiet of the night, the feeling of being alone but not lonely. There was something about it that made the rest of the world feel distant, unimportant. It was supposed to be simple, just a few days alone in the wild, away from everything. I had done it plenty of times before, but this trip was different. It started normally enough. I picked a remote area in a national forest, far from any roads or campsites. I wanted to be alone, away from other people. The drive out there was long, hours of winding roads through dense trees until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which reassured me. I had the place to myself. I checked my gear one last time before heading into the woods. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, extra food, a water filter, a first aid kit, a knife, a map, and a compass. I knew there wouldn't be any cell service, but I had marked my route carefully. I wasn't worried. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, cutting through towering trees and thick underbrush. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of animals in the bushes. I hiked for about 4 hours, deeper and deeper into the woods. The sun started sinking lower, and I found a spot near a small stream to set up camp. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and easy access to water. I set up my tent quickly and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I sat by the flames, eating a simple meal and listening to the sounds of the forest. The quiet was peaceful, comforting. That night I slept well. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside my tent, but it was distant, probably just an animal. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. The next morning I decided to explore. I packed a small bag with water, a snack, and my knife, then set off into the woods. There was no real destination. I just wanted to see what was out there. The forest was thick, the trees stretching high, their branches blocking most of the sunlight. I followed a small game trail, pushing through dense underbrush, stepping over fallen logs. It was beautiful, untouched. And then I found something strange. It was an old campsite. The tent was still there, collapsed, covered in leaves and dirt. A rusted pot sat near a fire pit, long cold. A backpack lay torn open, its contents scattered. I stopped. There were no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no fresh firewood. No indication that anyone had been here in a long time. But it didn't look abandoned by choice. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I took a step closer. There was a boot, half buried in the dirt. Just one. No sign of the other. A cold feeling crept over me. I turned and left, moving quickly, my earlier excitement gone. I made it back to my camp before sunset, but the unease didn't fade. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had left in a hurry. Maybe they had an emergency. Maybe. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every little sound made me tense up. The rustling in the bushes, the creak of the trees, the snap of a branch. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a different sound. Something was moving, close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was careful, deliberate. I held my breath, leaves crunching, a slow, steady sound. It was coming from just outside my tent. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body tight. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, the sun was rising. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Nothing. But then I saw it. The firewood I had stacked was scattered. Not knocked over. Not disturbed by an animal. Scattered. I packed up immediately. I moved fast, retracing my steps back to the trailhead. The forest that had felt peaceful before now felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in the corner of my eye. I never did, but I felt watched the whole way back. When I reached the parking lot, my car was still there. The only car. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. I had left the city early, hoping to reach the place by late afternoon, but the last stretch of road was nothing but gravel and potholes. It slowed me down more than I expected. My truck bounced and groaned over the uneven path, tires spitting dust and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other vehicles, not even an old hunting shack. Just miles of thick forest closing in from both sides, the trees growing taller and denser as I climbed higher into the hills. I had rented this cabin for a full week. I needed the break. Work had been draining me dry, and I couldn't stand the noise of the city anymore. I didn't want to hear cars honking or people yelling or the endless ringing of my phone. I wanted silence. I got what I asked for. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Small, isolated, and simple. Just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water, just an old rain barrel outside that was half full from the last storm. A shed stood a few yards away, filled with firewood and rusted tools. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, damp with the scent of pine and earth. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just whined through the branches. Perfect. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been here in months. Dust floated in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small, grimy window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I set my gear down and took a look around. The cot was covered in an old wool blanket. A few dead leaves curled in the corners. The wood stove was cold, a few charred logs sitting untouched inside. A stack of old newspapers sat on the table, yellowed and brittle. I dropped my bag beside the cot and got to work setting up. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled the lantern with oil, and checked my food supply. I had packed everything I needed: canned beans, jerky, rice, a couple of protein bars. Enough to last the week. The first night, I kept things simple, heating up a can of chili on the stove and eating in silence. By the time the sun set, the forest outside had become a black wall. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The cabin had only the lantern and the soft glow of the stove. Everything else beyond the window was pitch black. I stared out for a while, listening. Nothing, not even crickets. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to bed early, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. Something was moving outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened, straining my ears. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't darting around like a raccoon or sniffing like a deer. It was deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wooden walls. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, peering out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited. The footsteps had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, climbed back into bed, and lay awake for hours listening. Morning came slow. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold. I sat up, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. My mind was still foggy from the restless night. Then I saw the footprints, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The dirt around the porch was soft from the recent rain, and the tracks were clear. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the window before trailing off into the trees. My stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. The prints were human, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe some drifter had been passing through. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. But why would someone be wandering barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The forest was still, the air heavy and damp. The tracks led toward the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven 6 hours to get here. I had planned this trip for months. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been half dreaming the footsteps in the night. I decided to stay. I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopped wood, cleaned up the cabin, took a short hike, making sure not to wander too far. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to lock the door. I woke up to the creaking of the porch. Someone was standing outside. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboards groaned under slow, careful steps. Then silence. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, clicked it on. The light reflected off the window, blinding me for a moment. I squinted, heart pounding. Then I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. Filthy. Smiling. I recoiled, my pulse slamming in my ears. By the time I grabbed the hatchet from beside my bed and turned back, the face was gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight out. Nothing but empty woods. The trees swayed in the wind, branches creaking. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set. Dozens. They surrounded the cabin. Some led to the window. Others stopped at the door. My stomach turned. I had been surrounded all night. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, shoving my gear inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking. The wires had been cut. My chest tightened. My head felt light. I turned, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt them watching. I grabbed my bag, my hatchet, and started walking. The nearest road was miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I walked fast, then faster, then I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a small gas station on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, breathless, hands shaking. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't explain. I didn't know how to. I hitched a ride back to the city. Never went back for my truck. Never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but they had been close. Too close. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. First, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. Nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. but there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to. There's something about hiking alone at night that makes the world feel different. The trails I walk during the day, the ones I know like the back of my hand, take on a different personality after dark. The trees seem taller, their shadows deeper. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind shifting through the branches, stand out more. Even the dirt beneath my boots feels softer, quieter. I've always preferred hiking at odd hours. It started as a way to clear my head, a way to escape the noise of town. The woods around here are vast, spreading out in all directions, cutting through neighborhoods and stretching far beyond the highways. Some of the trails are well maintained, others barely used. I like to push deep into the lesser-known areas, the ones where you can walk for miles without seeing another person. There's something peaceful about it. Walking in the dark, knowing that most of the world is asleep while you're out there with nothing but the sound of your own breath and the rustling trees. Some nights, I hike so late that I end up watching the sunrise from deep in the woods. It's a sight that never gets old. How the darkness slowly melts into soft blues and oranges. How the first light filters through the leaves. It makes the long hikes worth it. But one night, I found something that made me rethink my whole routine. It was past midnight when I set out, later than usual. The air was cool, the kind of early autumn chill that makes your breath fog up just slightly. I had a good flashlight with me, but I preferred not to use it unless I had to. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and the moon was bright enough to guide me. I took one of the lesser-used trails, the kind that isn't marked on any official map but exists because enough people have walked it over the years. The dirt path twisted through the trees, cutting across a dry creek bed before climbing a gentle hill. I had been walking for over an hour when I spotted something unusual through the trees. A dim glow, just barely visible between the branches. I wasn't expecting to see a fire this deep in the woods. Campfires weren't unheard of out here, but they were rare, especially this far off the main trails. Most people who camped in these woods stuck to the designated areas closer to town. This was different. It wasn't just a fire. It was low to the ground, flickering unevenly, like it was burning in something unusual. Curiosity got the best of me. I stepped off the trail and moved toward the light, careful with my footing. The last thing I wanted was to snap a branch underfoot and announce my presence before I knew what I was walking into. As I got closer, I started to make out shapes. Structures, small ones, huddled together in a rough circle. They weren't tents. They weren't even real shelters. They looked like makeshift huts, pieced together from whatever scraps someone could find. Metal sheets, tarps, bed sheets strung up on sticks. Some of them barely stood taller than my waist. Others looked big enough for a person to crawl into. It was a shantytown right in the middle of the woods. The fire sat in the center of it all, burning inside the hollowed-out frame of an old tire. The rubber had burned away, leaving just the metal skeleton, blackened and misshapen from the heat. The flames flickered weakly, casting just enough light to see by. But there was no one there. That was the part that didn't make sense. The fire was still burning, but the whole place was silent. I stood still, listening, not just to the woods, but to the camp itself. If people were here, they were staying unnervingly quiet. No voices, no movement inside the shelters. Nothing. I took a slow step closer, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The structures weren't abandoned, not completely. There were things left behind. A pile of clothes next to one of the huts. A plastic grocery bag filled with canned food. An old radio with a cracked speaker. Someone had been living here. Recently, I should have turned back. I knew that even then, this wasn't my place. Whatever this was, whoever had built this, they clearly didn't want to be found. But something about the whole scene felt wrong. Why was the fire still burning? Why had they left it like that? I looked around, scanning the ground for footprints, for any sign of movement. The dirt near the fire was disturbed, but I couldn't tell how fresh the tracks were. They could have been made an hour ago. They could have been from earlier in the day. I took a few more steps, just enough to get a better look at the shelters. Up close, they looked even more fragile, held together with rope and duct tape. Some of them had pieces of furniture inside, old chairs, a small table with a broken leg, a foam mattress pad half covered with a sleeping bag. Still no people. That was when I felt it. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. It crept over me slow, like a chill working its way up my spine. I've spent enough time in the woods to trust my gut when it tells me something is wrong. And right then, it was screaming at me. I wasn't alone. The realization sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my body. My breathing slowed, my ears straining for any sound, any shift in the air. But there was nothing. Whoever had been here hadn't just walked away from their camp. They were still here, watching me. I didn't move, didn't turn my head. I just stood there, staring at the fire, listening. The woods were too quiet. No insects, no wind through the trees. Just silence. Then finally I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A footstep somewhere behind me. Not an animal. Not the sound of a branch falling or a leaf shifting. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. And then another. I turned and left. Not running, not panicking. Just walking, steady and controlled. Back the way I had come. My body was tense, waiting for the sound of movement behind me, waiting for whoever was out there to step into view. But they never did. I walked until the firelight faded behind me, until the woods swallowed it completely. Then, and only then, did I pick up my pace. My heart was hammering, my senses on high alert. I kept expecting to hear footsteps rushing up behind me, to feel a hand grabbing my shoulder. But nothing came. By the time I reached the main trail, the sun was starting to rise. The first light of morning cut through the trees, chasing away the shadows. I didn't stop walking until I was out of the woods completely. I never went back to that part of the forest again, and I never hiked at night after that.